Welcome to Revenge Gate. This story from Baltimore, Maryland is going to leave you speechless. My name is Holly, and I stood frozen at the altar while my white wedding dress turned crimson red in a single second right here in Baltimore. My sister stood before me holding the empty glass that she claimed slipped from her hand, but the malicious smirk on her face told a completely different story as the dark liquid soaked into the expensive silk. The entire church fell into a deathly silence because every guest knew exactly what they had just witnessed was an act of pure sabotage rather than a clumsy accident. While the rest of the congregation gasped in horror at the scene, the two people sitting in the front row decided to break the tension in the most heartbreaking way possible. My own parents stood up from their reserved seats and started clapping loudly, as if they were applauding a magnificent performance instead of their daughter's public humiliation. My best friend rushed forward with a handful of tissues to help me clean the mess, but I calmly pushed her hand away because I was done playing the victim. I walked straight up to my sister with a cold smile that was far more terrifying than any scream of anger could ever be. I leaned in close to her ear to ensure nobody else could hear the promise I was about to make as her smile faded. You think this is a victory, but you just signed the death warrant for our entire family. If you are watching this video, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are listening from, because tonight, you are going to learn what happens when the quiet one finally decides to destroy the people who betrayed her. 2 years before that fateful day at the altar, I began living a double life right in the middle of busy Baltimore to protect myself from my own relatives. I made a conscious decision to appear as the struggling failure they always assumed I was, because showing weakness was the only way to avoid their greed. I always showed up at family gatherings wearing gray work coveralls that were intentionally stained with grease and smelled faintly of industrial solvent. My family looked at my rough hands and tired eyes and saw a woman who spent her days scrubbing toilets for minimum reference. They never looked closely enough to notice that the exhaustion on my face came from managing complex logistics rather than physical labor. I played the role of the blue-collar disappointment so perfectly that they never once questioned why I was always busy during standard business hours. My sister Giselle never missed a single opportunity to use my job as a punchline to make herself feel superior during our Sunday dinners. She would wrinkle her nose in exaggerated disgust when I sat down at the table and ask loudly if I had remembered to sanitize myself before entering the house. She loved to tell her shallow friends that her younger sister was doing honest work while laughing behind her manicured hand as if my existence was a hilarious joke. I sat there eating my pot roast in silence while listening to her brag about her latest influencer campaign that actually paid her absolutely nothing. It was incredibly difficult to swallow her insults along with the food without screaming the truth in her face, but I knew that reacting would only make them dig deeper into my private life. The massive irony of their constant disrespect was that I actually owned the very company whose uniform I wore to dinner every single week. My business had grown from a single beat-up van into a massive operation called HM Waste Solutions, with over 300 employees on the payroll. I was not scrubbing floors for minimum wage because I was actually negotiating million-dollar deals for hazardous waste disposal with the largest hospital systems in Maryland. My tiny apartment was just a mailing address I kept to maintain the illusion while I actually lived in a quiet luxury townhouse across the city. I kept my name off the company letterhead and utilized a complex holding company structure to ensure that a simple Google search would never reveal my true net worth to my nosy relatives. My parents viewed my steady paycheck as a community pot that they could dip into whenever Giselle maxed out another one of her credit cards. They would corner me in the kitchen after dessert to guilt me about how hard it was to keep up with the rising mortgage payments or utility bills. Mom would cry dramatic tears about how they might lose the house while Dad stared at me with heavy expectation until I finally opened my wallet. I handed over hundreds of dollars every month from my hard-earned tips to cover expenses that Giselle created with her reckless spending habits. They took the crumpled cash without a single thank you because they felt entitled to the little bit of money they thought I had. I continued to hand over my money because it was a small price to pay to keep them away from my real assets. People often ask why I didn't just tell them the truth to earn their respect, but they don't understand the predatory nature of my family. If my parents knew that their janitor daughter was actually a millionaire CEO, they would not be proud of me for a single second. They would immediately demand that I hire Giselle as a vice president, or insist that I buy them a mansion in the suburbs to show my gratitude. They would sue me for a share of the profits or guilt me until I signed over control of the company I built from nothing. Playing the part of the ugly duckling was the only way to protect the golden egg that I had worked 18-hour days to create. I let them believe I was a failure because being underestimated was the safest place to be while I secured my future. 3 months before the wedding, the simmering cracks in my family finally exploded into an open war that destroyed whatever fragile peace remained between us. I was summoned to my parents' house for what I assumed was a routine discussion about the guest list or catering choices for the upcoming reception. Mom sat me down at the kitchen table with a serious expression, while Giselle looked at her phone with bored indifference as if my presence was a burden. They audaciously requested that I cancel my reservation at the prestigious Harbor Hotel to move the ceremony to their overgrown backyard next to the tool shed. They claimed that spending so much money on a lavish party was irresponsible when Giselle desperately needed a new luxury vehicle to maintain her image as a rising social media influencer. It was absolutely baffling to hear them suggest that my wedding budget should be reallocated to fund my sister's vanity project because they believed my job as a cleaner did not warrant a celebration of such magnitude. Shane was sitting right next to me, and he immediately shut down their ridiculous proposal with a firmness that completely surprised them. He refused to let his wife be treated like a second-class citizen on the most important day of her life, simply to satisfy Giselle's greed. He pulled out his checkbook right there at the table and declared that he had already paid the venue deposit in full, using his own savings. The silence in the room was palpable because they could not understand how a mechanic and a janitor could afford a venue that they themselves could never dream of booking. Their faces turned a shade of red that was a mix of embarrassment and burning jealousy rather than happiness for their daughter. They could not argue with the money already being spent, so they resorted to sulking like petulant children who had been denied a new toy. The tension continued to escalate a few weeks later when I went for my final dress fitting at an upscale boutique in downtown Baltimore. Giselle accompanied me only because Mom insisted that sisters should share these moments, but her eyes were filled with venom the entire time. She watched me step out of the dressing room in a designer gown that cost more than her entire wardrobe combined. She stood up from the velvet sofa with her fists clenched tight and spat out words that were designed to strip away my confidence. Giselle hissed at me through gritted teeth while checking her reflection in the mirror. "You are just a glorified janitor, so wearing that expensive dress is like putting lipstick on a pig because everyone knows you reek of bleach." It took every ounce of my self-control not to slap her right then and there, but I simply smoothed down the silk fabric and ignored her outburst. I knew that her cruelty stemmed from the fact that her own life was falling apart while mine was thriving in ways she could not understand. I paid for the dress with my own black card while she waited outside, completely unaware that the janitor she despised had a higher credit limit than her entire net worth. The breaking point arrived one rainy Tuesday evening when Shane and I stopped by the house to drop off the finalized seating arrangements. We walked through the unlocked front door and heard hushed voices drifting out from the living room down the hall. We stopped in the hallway when we realized they were not discussing logistics, but were actually hatching a malicious plan. They were laughing about how hilarious it would be to ruin my perfect day, since I refused to give them the money for the car. My heart hammered against my ribs as I listened to my own father encourage their cruel behavior instead of correcting it. He sounded almost giddy at the prospect of taking me down a peg in front of all our friends and extended family. I heard Dad say clearly from his armchair, "Just let her have the wedding, and then we will turn her big day into her most humiliating memory, so she remembers who is really the center of this house." Those words shattered the last remnant of hope I had held onto, that they might actually love me deep down. Shane looked at me with sorrow in his eyes and squeezed my hand hard enough to ground me back to reality. We could have walked into that room and screamed at them until our throats were raw with indignation. We could have canceled the wedding or uninvited them to save ourselves the embarrassment of their scheme. But running away would only give them the satisfaction of knowing they had gotten under my skin. We silently backed out of the house without making a sound and drove home in contemplative silence. We decided right then that we would not stop them from executing their plan because we needed them to expose their true nature to the world. We were going to let them set the trap, and then we were going to watch them walk right into it. 2 days after my wedding dress was ruined by my sister's malicious jealousy, instead of crying in my room like they expected, I was sitting in my lawyer's office in a high-rise building overlooking the harbor. Mr. Thompson sat across from me with a thick stack of documents that detailed every single financial secret my family had tried to hide. He adjusted his glasses and walked me through the forensic accounting report that revealed the precarious house of cards my parents had built to maintain their facade of middle-class stability. We discovered that the family home where I grew up had been mortgaged not once or twice, but 3 separate times to fund their lavish lifestyle. It turned out that the new kitchen renovation and the European vacations they bragged about were all paid for with borrowed money that they had no way of paying back. Giselle was in an even worse position because her credit card debt was astronomical due to her obsession with buying designer clothes to impress strangers on the internet. Mr. Thompson looked at me with a serious expression and explained that the local bank was already preparing to foreclose on the house within the next few months because they had missed 4 consecutive payments. This was the opportunity I had been waiting for to take control of the situation without ever having to raise my voice or throw a tantrum. I instructed Mr. Thompson to use the capital reserves from my holding company to purchase the distressed debt directly from the bank at a negotiated discount. It was a ruthless business maneuver that is usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers, but I felt absolutely no guilt applying it to the people who had cheered for my humiliation. I signed the heavy stack of paperwork with a steady hand and officially transformed from their disregarded daughter into their primary legal creditor. The transition of power was immediate and silent because they had no idea that the investment firm that bought their loan was actually owned by the janitor they mocked. I waited exactly 24 hours before instructing my legal team to send out the standard pay or quit notices via certified mail to both my parents' house and Giselle's apartment. These were not polite reminders to pay a late fee. They were aggressive legal demands requiring immediate payment of the full balance or facing immediate eviction proceedings. I could only imagine the chaotic scene that unfolded when the mailman delivered those terrifying envelopes to their doorsteps on a quiet Tuesday morning. The panic must have been instantaneous as the reality of their financial irresponsibility finally crashed down on them without mercy. My phone rang almost immediately after the delivery confirmation came through on my laptop, and I saw my mother's name flashing on the screen. I let it ring 4 times before answering because I wanted her to sweat a little bit before I played my part in this final act. I answered with a shaky voice to simulate the weakness she expected, and she didn't even waste a second on pleasantries or apologies for the wedding disaster. She was breathing heavily into the receiver as if she had just run a marathon, and her voice was a toxic mix of fear and her usual entitlement. Mom screamed into the phone with a desperation that was almost deafening. "Holly, you need to come home right now because the family is in big trouble, so bring all of your savings and Shane's money to save us." I held the phone away from my ear and smiled at Shane, who was sitting next to me drinking coffee and watching the entire plan unfold perfectly. She did not ask if I had the money. She simply demanded it. because she assumed that my only purpose in life was to serve as their financial safety net. I took a deep breath to steady my voice and delivered the line that would lure them into the trap we had set. I replied with a tone of feigned concern, "Mom, I don't keep that kind of cash at home, but let's meet at the Gold Leaf restaurant this weekend and I will hand you a check." She immediately agreed and hung up the phone without saying goodbye, or thanking me, probably already calculating how she would spend my money. She had no idea that the check I was planning to bring was not a bank draft, but a reality check that would bounce them right out of their comfortable lives. I placed the phone down on the desk and felt a profound sense of closure beginning to settle in my chest. The trap was officially set, and all I had to do now was wait for them to walk into the finest restaurant in Baltimore to receive their punishment. That weekend, my family walked into the most exclusive seafood restaurant in Baltimore, with looks of smug satisfaction and greed plastered across their faces. We had agreed to meet at the Gold Leaf because I wanted a setting that was formal enough to witness the complete destruction of their inflated egos. I arrived exactly on time with Shane by my side, but I was not surprised to see that Giselle and my parents were already seated at the best table by the window. They had clearly arrived 30 minutes early to take full advantage of my generosity, because the table was already crowded with appetizers and an ice bucket holding a bottle of expensive champagne. They did not look like a family on the brink of financial ruin who were about to lose the roof over their heads. They had dressed up in their finest clothes and were laughing loudly as if they were celebrating a lottery win rather than begging for a bailout. I sat down across from them and noticed that they had already ordered the lobster thermidor and the largest seafood tower on the menu without even waiting for us to arrive. Mom barely acknowledged my presence with a quick nod before turning her attention back to the menu to order another round of drinks. It was truly sickening to watch them gorge themselves on expensive delicacies while assuming that I was going to foot the bill with my hard-earned savings. They showed absolutely no remorse for the horrific scene they had caused at the church just a few days prior. In their twisted minds, the fact that I was there to help them meant that I had accepted my place beneath them and moved on. Giselle was already tipsy from the wine and decided that this was the perfect moment to twist the knife in my back a little deeper. She twirled her wine glass casually and looked at me with that same condescending smirk she had worn at the altar. Giselle laughed cruelly and said, "The dress thing the other day was just a little accident, so why are you acting so stressed about it? You are used to dealing with stains anyway." Shane stiffened beside me and his grip tightened on his fork, but I placed a calming hand on his knee to signal that he should wait. I forced a tight smile and remained silent because interrupting her now would ruin the surprise I had prepared. They interpreted my silence as submission and continued to eat with the ravenous appetite of people who believed they were entitled to everything I owned. Dad was particularly aggressive with his food, tearing into a crab leg with messy hands while constantly checking his watch. He was not enjoying the meal as much as he was enduring the waiting period before the payout. He eventually lost his patience completely and tapped his fingers loudly against the white tablecloth to get my attention. His face was flushed from the alcohol and his eyes were hard with expectation as he demanded what he came for. Dad glared at me and snapped, "Hurry up and eat so you can hand over the money because we need to sort out the bank situation first thing tomorrow morning, so stop stalling." I looked at the half-eaten food on my plate and realized I had lost my appetite the moment I walked into the restaurant. Shane and I sat perfectly still while watching them finish every last bite of their extravagant meal. It was a fascinating and grotesque study of human nature to watch them celebrate their assumed victory over me. They truly believed that they could abuse me, publicly destroy my wedding, and then summon me to pay off their debts, simply because we shared the same blood. I let the silence stretch out until the waiter finally approached our table with the leather folder containing the bill. Mom wiped her mouth with a napkin and looked at me with wide, expectant eyes as the waiter placed the check in the center of the table. She nodded her head toward the bill as if giving me permission to perform my duty as their financial savior. I reached into my large handbag slowly to build the anticipation of the moment. They were expecting a checkbook or a credit card that would make all their problems disappear instantly. Instead of a wallet, I pulled out a thick black legal folder that was heavy with the weight of their bad decisions. I did not say a word as I lifted the heavy binder and slammed it down onto the center of the table with enough force to make the silverware rattle. The sound echoed through the quiet dining room like a gunshot, signaling the end of their meal and the beginning of their nightmare. The smug smirk on Giselle's face vanished instantly the moment I slammed the heavy black folder onto the cold marble table. The unexpected noise caused the other diners to look over in surprise, but my family was too paralyzed by confusion to notice the audience. Mom looked from the folder to my face with a furrowed brow, clearly trying to understand why I had brought paperwork instead of a checkbook. She reached out a trembling hand to touch the leather cover as if she expected it to bite her, but I pulled it back out of her reach. The air in the private dining room shifted rapidly from an atmosphere of celebration to one of suffocating tension as they realized the dynamic had changed. I took a deep breath to savor the look of confusion in their eyes before I delivered the news that would shatter their world. I looked straight into my father's eyes and declared, "I did not bring money to pay off your debts on your behalf, but instead I came here today as the new legal owner of every single one of those debts." My father laughed nervously and tried to dismiss my words as a bad joke, asking what on earth I was talking about. I ignored his attempt to regain control and flipped the folder open to the very first page, which displayed the transfer of ownership documents. I spun the binder around so they could clearly see the red bank stamps and the notarized signatures at the bottom of the page. The documents authorized the transfer of the mortgage on their house and the collection rights for Giselle's credit cards to a company called HM Waste Solutions. Dad squinted at the paper and muttered the name of the company out loud, still failing to make the connection between the business and his daughter. I pointed to the signature line for the CEO of the acquiring company, and their eyes widened in unison when they saw my full name signed in bold black ink. Giselle turned a ghostly shade of pale, and her mouth opened and closed repeatedly like a fish out of water as the realization hit her. She looked at me with a mixture of horror and disbelief, struggling to reconcile the image of her janitor sister with the CEO on the paper. I leaned forward across the table to ensure she heard every single word of the reality check I was about to deliver. I stared at her terrified face and said, "You always complain that I smell like trash, but that pile of trash generates over $2 million in net revenue for me every single year, while you are nothing but a round zero." The silence that followed my declaration was heavy enough to crush them as they processed the magnitude of their mistake. They had spent years mocking the very source of wealth that could have secured their future if they had only shown a shred of decency. Mom looked down at her expensive dress and then back at me, finally understanding that the daughter she had treated like a servant was actually the most powerful person at the table. Shane decided that he had seen enough of their stunned silence and stood up from his chair with a look of pure disgust on his face. He had been biting his tongue for years every time they insulted me, and now he was ready to let it all out. Shane pointed a shaking finger at the designer clothes they were wearing and said, "Every single thing you have, from those designer handbags to this expensive meal, exists because of Holly, yet you chose to bite the hand that feeds you." My parents shrank back into their chairs under his accusation because they knew there was no lie in his words. The room felt incredibly small as the walls of their arrogance came crumbling down around them. The fear in their eyes was no longer about the bank or the eviction notices. It was the terrifying realization that the person holding the axe was the same person they had spent a lifetime sharpening it against. Dad looked at the documents again, his hands shaking so badly that he knocked over his wine glass, sending a dark red stain spreading across the white tablecloth. It was a poetic reflection of the wine Giselle had spilled on my dress, but this time, nobody was clapping. They were staring at the stain in horror because they knew that, unlike a dress, the mess they had made of their lives could not be cleaned up. I closed the folder with a sharp snap that signaled the end of the presentation and the beginning of the execution. They were no longer my family. They were simply delinquent tenants sitting across from a landlord who had run out of patience. The deadly silence inside the VIP room was suddenly shattered by the aggressive ringing of Giselle's cell phone sitting on the table. She looked at the screen with a confused frown because the caller ID displayed the name of the towing company she used for roadside assistance. She answered the call on speakerphone because her hands were shaking too violently to hold the device up to her ear properly. A rough voice on the other end informed her without any sympathy that her luxury vehicle was currently being hooked up to a tow truck in the restaurant parking lot. The driver explained that the repossession order had come directly from the line holder due to a violation of the payment terms under the new ownership agreement. Giselle screamed that there must be a mistake and tried to run toward the window to stop them, but she froze when she saw my signature on the repo order the driver texted to her phone. I sat there calmly sipping my water while she watched her beloved status symbol being dragged away by the very company she had spent years mocking. The chaos continued to escalate a few moments later when the heavy oak doors opened to reveal Mr. Thompson walking into the room with a briefcase. My parents looked at him with wide eyes as he placed a formal legal envelope directly in front of my father on the dinner table. Dad opened the packet with trembling fingers and pulled out a document that had "Notice to Vacate" printed in bold red letters across the top. Mr. Thompson explained in a professional monotone that since the property deed had been transferred to HM Waste Solutions, the current occupants were required to vacate the premises within 30 days. The color drained from my father's face until he looked like a walking corpse, because the reality of homelessness was finally staring him in the face. They looked at me for some sign that this was just a cruel prank, but my expression remained as cold and unyielding as the marble table between us. Shane decided that it was time to deliver the final blow to their reputation by pulling his smartphone out of his pocket. He navigated to a popular social media platform and turned the screen around so they could see the video that was currently trending locally. It was high-definition footage of Giselle pouring the wine on my dress, clearly showing her malicious intent and their subsequent applause. The video had already garnered thousands of views, and the comments section was filled with strangers calling them trashy and cruel. Shane scrolled down to show Giselle an email notification from the fashion brand she was supposed to represent the following month. They had seen the footage and were terminating her contract immediately because they refused to be associated with someone who would sabotage a wedding. The digital empire Giselle had built on lies and filters was crumbling in real time right in front of her eyes. The combined weight of losing their car, their home, and their reputation in the span of 10 minutes finally broke through their arrogance. My mother's face crumpled into a mask of pure terror as she realized they had absolutely no leverage left to use against me. She scrambled out of her chair and rushed around the table to grab my hand with a grip that was desperate and sweaty. She looked into my eyes with tears streaming down her face, hoping to manipulate me one last time with the guilt trip that had worked for years. Mom squeezed my hand tightly and wailed, "Holly, my good daughter, you cannot do this to your family because we are blood, so please forgive your sister." I looked down at her hand on my arm and felt absolutely nothing but a profound sense of relief that I no longer cared. The woman who had clapped while I was humiliated was now begging for mercy only because she had lost her power. I stood up slowly and pulled my hand away from her grasp with a sharp motion that made her stumble back. I smoothed out the wrinkles on my dress and picked up my purse while looking at the 3 people who had been strangers to me for a long time. I looked at them with zero emotion and said, "The blood ties ended the moment you clapped at my wedding, so pay for this meal yourselves, as your first lesson in independence." I turned my back on their sobbing figures and walked out of the restaurant with Shane holding my hand tightly. We left them sitting there with a $1,000 bill they could not pay and a lifetime of regret they would never be able to escape. 6 months have passed since that fateful dinner at the restaurant, and the biting cold of the Baltimore winter no longer makes me feel chilled to the bone because my life is finally filled with genuine warmth. The silence in our home is no longer a heavy burden but a peaceful sanctuary where Shane and I are happily preparing for the arrival of our first child. We spent the last few weeks painting the nursery in soft pastel colors and assembling furniture for the baby who will grow up knowing only love and support. My business has continued to expand rapidly into neighboring states because the scandal surrounding my family actually proved to my investors that I am a leader who can make difficult decisions under pressure. I often sit by the fireplace in our beautiful new villa and reflect on how much lighter the world feels when you cut the dead weight of toxic relationships out of your life completely. My parents did not fare nearly as well because the consequences of their financial negligence caught up with them exactly 30 days after the restaurant incident. They were legally evicted from the family home they had mortgaged 3 times over and were forced to move into a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a rough neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The transition from a spacious house to a tiny apartment where the heating barely works was a brutal wake-up call that shattered their remaining pride. They were forced to come out of retirement because their Social Security checks could not cover their rent and their mounting debts. My father now spends his days bagging groceries at the local supermarket, while my mother scans items at the register with a look of permanent misery etched onto her face. They are forced to serve the same neighbors they used to look down on, and the humiliation of their fall from grace is written in every line of their tired faces. Giselle suffered the most poetic justice of all because her refusal to develop any real skills left her with absolutely no options when her influencer career evaporated overnight. She applied for dozens of office jobs, but was rejected every single time because a background check quickly revealed the viral video of her vandalizing my wedding. She eventually had no choice but to accept the only position that was available to someone with her reputation and lack of experience. My sister is now working as a janitorial staff member for a commercial cleaning company that happens to be one of my smaller competitors in the city. She spends her nights scrubbing floors and cleaning toilets in office buildings while wearing a uniform that is far less flattering than the one I used to wear. The irony of her situation is not lost on anyone because she is now performing the exact same manual labor that she spent years mocking me for doing. I actually saw the 3 of them yesterday while Shane was driving me to my prenatal checkup at the hospital downtown. They were standing huddled together at a bus stop in the freezing rain because they could no longer afford to maintain a vehicle. They looked gray and defeated as they waited for public transportation to take them to their minimum wage jobs. I watched them shivering in their thin coats through the tinted window of our warm luxury SUV, but I did not ask Shane to pull over or offer them a ride. I felt absolutely no urge to save them because I finally understood that their suffering was a direct result of their own choices. We drove past them without slowing down because looking back at the past would only distract us from the beautiful future we are building. This entire painful experience has taught me several invaluable lessons that I will make sure to pass on to my own children one day. The most important lesson is that a person's value is never defined by the clothes they wear or the job title they hold, but by the integrity of their character. We must never tolerate people who use the sacred bond of family as a weapon to manipulate us or demand things they have not earned. Cutting ties with toxic family members is not an act of cruelty, but a necessary act of self-preservation to protect your own mental health and future. The universe has a way of balancing the scales because karma is always watching and will eventually serve everyone exactly what they deserve. Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end and for supporting me through this incredible journey of justice and redemption. I truly appreciate every single one of you who stood by my side in the comments section and validated my decision to stand up for myself. Please subscribe to the channel and share your own thoughts in the comments below because I would love to hear how you would have handled this situation.